Cannibalism is a topic which has horrified and fascinated people for centuries. Almost instinctively, most people find the idea of cannibalizing another person revolting. It's likely this aversion that makes stories of cannibalism for survival so interesting. They serve as a reminder that people will do almost anything when their lives are threatened, regardless of the moral principles they normally hold. But what happens when someone's harrowing story of survival is covering something up? Something even darker than cannibalism. My name is Kasia, the Lunar Librarian, and today I'll be exploring the case of Alferd Packer, also known as the Colorado Cannibal. Alferd Greiner Packer was born in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania on January 21, 1842, one of three children of James Packer and Esther Greiner. Alferd had a poor relationship with his family, and by 1862 he had left his home and moved to Minnesota. With the Civil War raging, Packer enlisted in the United States military in April of 1862. However, 8 months later, Packer was honorably discharged for medical reasons. Alferd Packer reportedly suffered from severe epilepsy and suffered multiple seizures a day. Following his discharge, Packer moved to Iowa. In June of 1863, he attempted to enlist again, this time with the 8th Iowa Volunteer Cavalry, but was discharged again for medical reasons on April 22, 1864. After his second discharge, Packer drifted west, working various odd jobs, although he never lasted more than a few months with any one employer. In addition to his seizures, which made it hard for him to work, Packer was a quarrelsome and generally unlikable person who had a tendency to steal from his employers and pick fights with his co-workers. Packer eventually moved to Colorado, where he attempted to find work as a miner. However, like his previous endeavors, Packer had little success in mining and had moved on to Salt Lake City by 1873. In November of 1873, a vein of gold was struck near Breckenridge, Colorado, prompting a large migration of miners into the area. Upon hearing this, Packer decided to return to Colorado and joined a caravan of 20 other miners who planned to take the Old Mormon Trail to Breckenridge. Initially, the other men were hesitant about letting Packer join. He didn't have any money, mining equipment, or even provisions for the journey. However, Packer claimed to have prior knowledge of the route, which was becoming snowed in and difficult to navigate. Furthermore, Packer told the caravan that he had worked previously as a wilderness guide in Colorado and could lead the caravan safely through the mountains to their destination. Seeing as winter was approaching, and none of the other men had any knowledge of the area, they relented and allowed Packer to join them. Unfortunately, Packer had greatly exaggerated his abilities as a guide. He had previously been a wilderness guide in Colorado. However, he had only lasted a few months before being fired for gross incompetence. Additionally, Packer was completely unable to navigate due to his condition, and frequently got lost and confused in the wilderness during expeditions. Packer's companions also found him to be lazy and annoying, refusing to work and picking fights with other members of the group. By January, thanks to Packer's navigation, the group was completely lost, with dwindling provisions in the harsh Colorado winter. Fortunately for the men, they happened upon a Ute encampment led by Chief Ouray. Ouray offered to let the men stay with them until spring, when it would be safe to continue their journey. Some of the men had enough of the cold, low provisions, and Packer's poor navigation, and decided to remain with the Utes. However, others, Packer included, wanted to carry on immediately in order to reach Breckenridge and stake a claim as soon as possible. Ouray advised the men against this, telling them that traveling through the mountains during the winter was extremely dangerous, and that none of his people would be willing to try it. Despite the risks, Ouray saw that he would be unable to convince the men, so he offered them provisions for their journey and advised them to continue following the Mormon Trail. Packer, however, claimed to know a shortcut through the San Juan Mountains. While most of the group had gotten tired of Packer and no longer trusted his advice, he somehow managed to convince Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, Israel Swan, and George California Noon to follow his route. Despite Packer's navigational shortcomings and the fact that his route was far more difficult to traverse normally, let alone in heavy snowfall, Packer's group split off from the rest of the caravan and headed off into the San Juan Mountains. On April 16, 1874, almost 2 months later, Packer stumbled into the mess hall at the Los Pinos Indian Agency, disheveled and visibly distraught. After the employees of the agency calmed him down, Packer began to tell them what had happened. He claimed that his companions had found his condition burdensome and had left him for dead. He says the men had given Packer a rifle for protection before abandoning him to the elements and continuing on without him. After staying at the agency to recover, Packer rented a room in the nearby town of Saguache, Colorado. It was here that people began to question the accuracy of his story. People noted that Packer was far from malnourished and did not look as though he had been abandoned with no provisions. In fact, he was rather overweight. Additionally, other members of Packer's original caravan, those who stayed with Ore, had found their way to Saguache as well. Right away, they pointed out that Packer's companions weren't the type of people to abandon someone, especially someone with Packer's disability, to die. Additionally, Packer had apparently spent around $100 at the saloon on a room and a large bar tab. Despite this spending, Packer couldn't provide an explanation of how he got this money. Furthermore, Packer's conduct began to draw suspicion. He would drink heavily, and while drunk, he would tell his story of survival to anyone who would listen. This story, however, changed every time he told it, sometimes drastically. In addition to all of this, Preston Nutter, one of the men in the expedition who had chosen to remain with Ore, pointed out that Packer not only had inexplicable sums of money, but had taken personal items from his companions. In particular, Nutter noted that Packer was in possession of a customized hunting knife that belonged to Frank Miller. Miller's knife held sentimental value to him, and he would not have simply left it behind where Packer could find it. With Packer's companions still missing, and the numerous suspicious circumstances around him, officers from the Los Pinos Indian Agency arrested Alferd Packer. After he was arrested, Packer confessed that his companions were, in fact, dead. Packer claims that after they had departed Ore's camp, the group had gotten lost and exhausted their provisions. He confessed that Swan and Humphreys had died of starvation and exposure, and that the remaining men had eaten their bodies. When the meat from these two men ran out, Packer claims that Bell succumbed to desperation. He killed Miller and later California for food. Packer then claims that Bell attacked him, attempting to do the same, forcing Packer to shoot him in self-defense. Agents noted, however, that this didn't explain why Packer had taken the money and personal items of his companions, including Miller's knife. Given the mounting suspicion of almost everyone in the small town at this point, and the discrepancies in Packer's story, officials did not accept this confession and formally charged him with the murder of Shannon Bell. While awaiting trial, however, Packer escaped from prison in Saguache and went on the run. Packer evaded capture for 8 years until in 1883 he was recognized and arrested in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and sent back to Colorado to face trial. After returning to Colorado, Packer changed his story yet again. In this new version, Packer claimed that he had been sent out by the men to scavenge for firewood. Upon returning to the camp, Packer claimed that he found Shannon Bell in a delusional state, cooking the remains of Frank Miller. Packer attempted to approach Bell, but Bell attacked him with an axe. Packer then claims to have shot Bell in self-defense. He then discovered that Bell had already killed the rest of the group. Following the death of his companions, Packer claimed he remained at the camp until he completely ran out of food. Once he'd ran out of food, Packer admitted that he had cooked and eaten pieces of his companions. He then cooked additional meat to bring with him, took the money and property of his companions, which he claimed they no longer needed, and made his way to the Los Pinos agency. Law enforcement found this amended confession incredibly suspicious. Firstly, nothing Packer admitted to doing was a crime. If Bell had actually attacked him, Packer would have been legally justified to shoot him. Furthermore, cannibalism itself was not a crime. Therefore, if Packer's story were true, why hadn't he just said so when he first arrived at Los Pinos? Furthermore, if Packer were innocent and had truly killed Shannon Bell in self-defense after Bell had murdered the rest of the group, why had he escaped prison and evaded trial for 8 years? Then there was the fact that Alferd Packer benefited considerably from the death of his companions. Packer left Utah penniless, apparently too poor to even afford provisions or mining equipment for the journey. However, just a few months later, months he spent lost in the Colorado wilderness, Packer spent $100 just on partying in Saguache. $100 when adjusted for inflation would be worth over $2,000 today. Additionally, Packer offered the saloon keeper, Larry Dolan, a $300 loan for his business, which Dolan believed Packer would have been good for, making it clear that Packer's time lost in the mountains had, somehow, been very profitable for him. Although there was no physical evidence implicating Packer in the death of his companions, the jury found the financial motive, as well as Packer's suspicious behavior, to be conclusive, and on April 13, 1883, Alferd Packer was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Packer's luck, however, was about to turn. Due to a technicality, Packer's death sentence could not be upheld. Packer's crimes were committed in 1874 in the territory of Colorado. However, 2 years later, while Packer was in hiding, Colorado became a state. Colorado's new state constitution did not allow for the death sentence for any crime not committed within the state of Colorado, which technically did not apply to Packer since his crimes were committed in the territory of Colorado. As a result, Packer's conviction was overturned. Instead, he was charged with 5 counts of manslaughter, 1 for each of his companions, for which he was found guilty and sentenced to a cumulative 40 years in prison. However, Packer continued to write letters to friends and campaign for his innocence from within prison. One of those friends, Dwayne Hatch, put him in contact with a reporter for the Denver Post called Polly Pry. Pry believed Packer's story, and along with Hatch began a public campaign to get Alferd Packer paroled. This campaign was ultimately successful, and Alferd Packer was granted parole in 1901, having only served 18 years of his 40-year sentence. After his release from prison, Packer went on to live a relatively unassuming life in Colorado, until his death in 1907. It was not until 1989, 82 years after Packer's death, that the remains of his victims were discovered. Forensic analysis proved that Shannon Bell was indeed shot by Packer, as he had described. However, 2 other men had puncture wounds which were almost identical to the one found on Bell, suggesting that Packer shot these men as well. Furthermore, all 5 of the men show signs of extensive butchering, including numerous depression and butterfly fractures, contradicting Packer's claims of minimal cannibalism. Ultimately, this led the forensic team to conclude that Packer had most likely killed his companions. They theorized that Packer realized he wouldn't make it to Breckenridge, so he instead opted to make some money by robbing his companions. However, after he had killed them, lost and with no other food, he resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. While Alferd Packer died in 1907, his story has gone on to inspire numerous works of fiction, from books and comics to a comedy musical produced by Trey Parker and Matt Stone. Additionally, in a somewhat humorous homage, students at the University of Colorado in 1968 named their cafeteria restaurant the Alferd Packer Memorial Grill, which was later renamed to the Alferd Packer Restaurant and Grill, a name which it bears to this day. Ironically, despite the dark nature of Packer's crimes, his legacy is one of comedic homages and humorous references more than anything else. Anyways, I've been the Lunar Librarian, and if you've found and enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I plan to make videos covering more historical true crime cases like this one, so if that sounds interesting to you, please consider sticking around. Also, as I'm sure you've noticed, this is my first video, so if you have any feedback or suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. It's always appreciated and definitely super helpful. Anyways, thanks for sticking around, and I hope I see you in the next video.